I watched the confusion spread across my future daughter-in-law's face as she opened the envelope. Inside was not the check she'd been expecting, but a note written in my careful handwriting. Some traditions aren't meant to be broken. The rehearsal dinner around us continued. Glasses clinking, laughter bubbling, but the air between Melissa and me had frozen solid. My son Thomas shot me a worried glance from across the table. He knew. After 30 years of raising him, he could read my expressions like a book. But he had no idea what I had set in motion or why. Some wounds run too deep for explanations. 6 months earlier, I'd been cleaning out the attic of the home where I'd lived for over 3 decades when I found the garment bag. Even through the thick plastic, I recognized the delicate lace of my wedding dress, preserved with cedar sachets and tender care. I unzipped the bag and ran my fingers across the ivory fabric, memories washing over me like gentle waves. "Mom?" Thomas called from downstairs. "Where do you want these boxes?" I carefully rezipped the bag. "Just stack them by the door, honey. I'll sort through them later." Thomas appeared at the top of the attic stairs, his 6-foot frame ducking under the low ceiling. At 32, he looked more like his father every day, a fact that both warmed and wounded my heart. Edward had been gone for 5 years now, taken by a heart attack that gave us no time for goodbyes. "What's that?" Thomas asked, pointing to the garment bag. "My wedding dress," I said, unable to keep the softness from my voice. "I was thinking Melissa might like to see it. Maybe there's something she could use something borrowed for your wedding." A strange expression crossed Thomas's face. "Mom, you know Melissa's pretty set on doing things her own way." "Of course," I said quickly. "It was just a thought." But later that evening, when Thomas and Melissa came for dinner, I brought it up again. "I found my wedding dress today," I said as I served the pot roast I'd spent all afternoon preparing. "It's still in beautiful condition." Melissa looked up from her phone, her expression polite but disinterested. At 28, she was beautiful, ambitious, and completely different from the kind of woman I'd imagined my son would marry. She worked 70-hour weeks at a marketing firm downtown and approached her wedding planning with the same ruthless efficiency. "That's nice," she said, returning to her phone. "I thought perhaps you might like to see it," I continued. "Not to wear, of course, but maybe there's a bit of lace or—" "Mom," Thomas interrupted gently. "Melissa's dress is already being custom made. It's going to be perfect, right, babe?" Melissa nodded without looking up. "The designer's flying in from New York for the final fitting next month." I set down my fork, feeling that familiar ache that had become my constant companion since Edward died. It wasn't just about the dress. It was about connection, about passing something down, about keeping Edward present somehow in this important moment. "Of course," I said. "It sounds wonderful." The conversation moved on, but something had shifted in me. I'd spent the past 5 years trying to rebuild my life, trying to find my place in a world that suddenly felt too big without Edward beside me. I'd thrown myself into helping with the wedding, offering to handle the flowers, the catering, the venue. Melissa had declined each offer, preferring to work with her wedding planner, a rail-thin woman named Jade who spoke exclusively in terms of concepts and aesthetics. 2 weeks later, I came home from my volunteer shift at the hospital to find Thomas in my kitchen, a sheepish look on his face. "I hope you don't mind," he said, kissing my cheek. "I needed to grab some of my old paperwork from the attic." "Find everything you needed?" I asked, setting my purse down. "Yeah, and I took care of that old dress you mentioned, made some room up there for you." My heart stuttered. "What old dress?" Thomas's expression turned uncertain. "Your wedding dress? I figured since you brought it up, you were looking to get rid of it." "Melissa's been after me to help you declutter before we—" He stopped, seeing my face. "Mom?" I pushed past him and rushed up to the attic, my knees protesting as I climbed the steep stairs. The space where the garment bag had been was empty. Thomas, I said, my voice barely audible. What did you do with my dress? He appeared at the top of the stairs, confusion written across his features. I took it to Goodwill with some of the other old stuff. Mom, I thought. You thought? My voice rose. You thought you could throw away my wedding dress. The dress I wore when I married your father. The dress I've kept for 34 years. I'm sorry, he said, looking genuinely distressed. I thought since you mentioned it to Melissa and she wasn't interested, that I wanted to throw away one of the most precious things I own. Tears sprang to my eyes. That dress was the last piece of my wedding day I still had. The flowers are long gone, the cake was eaten, the photographs are fading, but that dress, I couldn't continue. Thomas reached for me, but I stepped back. I'll go back to Goodwill right now. Maybe they haven't processed it yet. But it was too late. The dress was gone, sold or discarded, lost to me forever. And with it, a piece of Edward, a piece of our beginning, a piece of my heart. Just go, I whispered. Mom, please. Go, Thomas. After he left, I sat on the attic floor and wept for the first time since Edward's funeral. I cried for the girl I'd been, 22 and radiant in ivory lace. I cried for Edward, who had looked at me in that dress as if I were the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. And I cried for the woman I was now, 63 and alone, with a son who didn't understand what he had taken from me. In the days that followed, Thomas called repeatedly, but I let the calls go to voicemail. He sent flowers, wrote notes, even came by the house, but I couldn't bring myself to see him. The loss of the dress had cracked open something inside me, revealing a well of grief I'd been trying to contain for 5 years. It wasn't just about the dress. I realized as I lay awake night after night, it was about feeling erased. Since Edward died, I'd been slowly disappearing. My opinions mattered less. My needs were considered last, if at all. I had become an afterthought in my own family, a relic to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Thomas and Melissa's wedding plans continued without my input. Invitations were sent. The venue was booked, not the garden at the country club, where Thomas had once promised me he'd marry, but a sleek modern art gallery downtown that reflected Melissa's taste. The menu was set, not the family recipes I'd offered to share, but an avant-garde selection from a chef known for molecular gastronomy. A month after the dress incident, Melissa's mother Patricia called me. Eleanor, she said, her voice dripping with forced cheer. I wanted to touch base about the mother of the groom luncheon. I've reserved a private room at Le Cirque for the 16th. I hadn't been consulted about the date, the venue, or even the concept of such a luncheon. I'm afraid I have my hospital volunteer shift that day, I said. Oh, Patricia sounded surprised that I might have existing commitments. Well, surely you can reschedule. This is your son's wedding week after all. I'd been volunteering at the same hospital where Edward had worked as a surgeon for the past 4 years. My Wednesday shift in the children's wing was sacred to meth. Young patients looked forward to my visits, and I'd found healing in bringing them comfort. I'll see what I can do, I said noncommittally. Wonderful! And Melissa wanted me to confirm that you'll be wearing navy blue for the ceremony. All the mothers and grandmothers will be in coordinating tones. Another decision made without me. I'd actually found a lovely silver gown, I began. Oh, but that won't work with the color palette, Patricia interrupted. Navy is really best. I'm sure you understand. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table, staring out at the garden Edward and I had planted together. The azaleas he'd loved were in bloom, their pink blossoms bright against the green. I thought about all the plans we'd made, the future we'd imagined, including seeing our children marry. Edward should have been here to walk Thomas down the aisle, to dance with me at the reception, to whisper inappropriate jokes in my ear during the toasts. But he wasn't. and I was being treated like an inconvenient prop rather than the mother who had raised Thomas, who had kissed his scraped knees and stayed up with him when he had nightmares and taught him to be the man he was. That evening, I drove to the bank and withdrew $20,000 from my savings account. It was money Edward and I had set aside years ago for Thomas's wedding. We'd imagined a celebration that would honor our family traditions while creating new memories. But that vision, like so many others, had died with Edward. I'd planned to give Thomas and Melissa the money as a wedding gift. They'd hinted broadly about wanting funds for a down payment on a condo. But as I held the cashier's check in my hand, a different idea began to form. The next day, I called Thomas for the first time since the dress incident. "Mom," he answered immediately, relief evident in his voice. "I've been so worried." "I'd like to meet with you and Melissa," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "There's something important we need to discuss." We arranged to meet at a cafe near Melissa's office. When I arrived, they were already seated, Thomas fidgeting nervously with a sugar packet while Melissa checked her watch. "Thank you for meeting me," I said as I slid into the booth across from them. "Mom, I'm so sorry about the dress," Thomas began. "I've been sick about it. I called every Goodwill in the city, but they couldn't track it down." I held up a hand. "That's not why I asked to meet." Melissa glanced at her watch again. "I have a client call in 30 minutes, she said. "This won't take long," I assured her. I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope. "I wanted to give you this." Thomas took the envelope, a question in his eyes. "Your father and I set aside money for your wedding many years ago," I explained. $20,000 to be exact. Melissa's eyes widened, and for the first time since I'd met her, she gave me her full attention. "That's incredibly generous," she said, already reaching for the envelope. "However," I continued, "I've decided to make a change in how that money will be used." Thomas paused, the envelope halfway to Melissa. "What do you mean?" "The money will still go toward the wedding," I said carefully, "but instead of giving it directly to you, I'll be handling specific aspects of the celebration myself." Melissa's smile faltered. "What aspects exactly?" "I'd like to take charge of the rehearsal dinner for one," I said. "And I have some ideas for personalized touches throughout the ceremony and reception." "But we've already planned everything," Melissa protested. "The wedding planner has a complete design concept." "I'm sure she does," I said with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "But, as the mother of the groom, I'd like to make my contribution. It's traditional, after all." Thomas looked between us, clearly sensing the tension. "I think it's a great idea," he said too brightly. "Mom has amazing taste, and it would mean a lot to have her more involved." Melissa's jaw tightened, but with $20,000 at stake, she couldn't outright refuse. "We could discuss it with Jade," she conceded reluctantly. "Wonderful," I said, standing. "I'll be in touch with her directly." As I walked away, I heard Melissa hissing to Thomas, "Did you know about this? Why didn't you tell me she was going to hijack our wedding?" I smiled to myself as I stepped into the sunshine. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of the woman I used to be, the woman who didn't let others dictate her worth. That evening, I called my oldest friend, Margaret, who had been by my side through Edward's illness and death, and my struggles since. "You did what?" she exclaimed when I told her my plan. "I'm taking control of certain aspects of the wedding," I repeated, "with my own money." "Eleanor," Margaret said cautiously, "are you sure this is about the wedding, or is it about something else?" I sighed, twisting the gold band I still wore on my left hand. When Thomas threw away my dress, it felt like he was throwing away a piece of his father, a piece of our history. And Melissa treats me like I'm some relic to be managed, not a person with feelings and opinions. "Have you told Thomas how you feel?" "He wouldn't understand," I said. "He's so caught up in Melissa's world now. I I want them to remember that I matter too, that our family history matters. And how exactly do you plan to make them remember? Margaret asked, concern evident in her voice. I smiled, looking at the notebook where I'd begun jotting down ideas. By giving them a wedding they'll never forget. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into wedding preparations with an energy I hadn't felt in years. I met with Jade, Melissa's wedding planner, who initially treated me with the same dismissive politeness Melissa did. But when I mentioned my $20,000 budget, her attitude changed dramatically. "We could certainly incorporate some of your ideas, Mrs. Mitchell," she said, tapping her stylus against her tablet. "What did you have in mind?" "I'd like to handle the rehearsal dinner entirely," I said, "and I have some thoughts about special moments during the reception." Jade looked uncomfortable. "Melissa has been very specific about the aesthetic. Very clean, very modern. No traditional elements." "I understand completely," I said with a smile, "and I wouldn't dream of disrupting her vision. My contributions will be subtle." I didn't tell JD or Thomas or Melissa exactly what I had planned. I made arrangements quietly, contacting vendors directly, having private conversations with the venue manager, and securing special items that would be revealed only at the appropriate moment. 2 weeks before the wedding, I hosted a small luncheon for Melissa and her bridesmaids. I'd suggested it as a peace offering, and to my surprise, Melissa had accepted. "This is lovely, Eleanor." Melissa's maid of honor gushed as she surveyed the elegant spread in my dining room. "Did you do all this yourself?" "I enjoy entertaining," I said simply, pouring champagne into crystal flutes that had been a wedding gift to Edward and me. Melissa circulated among her friends, her smile not quite reaching her eyes whenever she looked my way. Finally, when the other women were engaged in conversation, she approached me in the kitchen. "Thomas told me how upset you were about the dress," she said, her voice low. "I want you to know I had nothing to do with that." I continued arranging chocolate-dipped strawberries on a serving plate. "I never said you did." "He was trying to help. We're both concerned about how you're adjusting." I set down the plate and turned to face her. "Adjusting?" Melissa had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Since Edward died, Thomas worries that you're stuck in the past. The way you keep this house exactly the same, all the old photos everywhere, even still wearing your wedding ring." She gestured to my left hand. "It's been 5 years, Eleanor." For a moment, I couldn't speak through the tightness in my throat. Then I lifted my chin and met her gaze directly. "When you've been married for 29 years to the love of your life, Melissa, perhaps you'll understand that 5 years is nothing, a heartbeat." The blink of an eye. I picked up the plate again. "Shall we join the others?" The day of the rehearsal dinner arrived, and with it the beginning of my carefully orchestrated plan. I'd reserved a private room at Edward's favorite restaurant, an old-world steakhouse with dark wood paneling and red leather booths. It wasn't the sleek, Instagram-worthy venue Melissa would have chosen, but it was meaningful to our family. I arrived early to oversee the final details. The tables were arranged exactly as I'd requested, with the bride and groom seated at the center of the main table. At each place, setting was a small silver frame containing a photograph different for each guest, showing them with Thomas at various points in his life. For Thomas's childhood friends, there were pictures of Little League games and high school graduation. For family members, holiday gatherings, and family vacations. For Melissa's parents, the day Thomas and Melissa had announced their engagement. And at Melissa's place, a photograph of Edward holding newborn Thomas in the hospital, his face alight with pride and joy. It was one of my favorite pictures, one that captured the depth of a father's love for his son. The guests began to arrive, exclaiming over the thoughtful place settings. Thomas moved around the room, picking up frames and laughing at the memories they evoked. Melissa circulated more stiffly, her smile fixed as she surveyed the decidedly traditional setting that clashed with her modern sensibilities. When everyone was seated, I stood and tapped my glass for attention. Thank you all for being here tonight, I said, looking around at the faces of those who had been part of our lives for decades. As we prepared to celebrate Thomas and Melissa's wedding tomorrow, I wanted to take this opportunity to honor not just their future together, but the past that has shaped Thomas into the man he is today. I saw Thomas shift uncomfortably in his seat. Melissa stared straight ahead. Many of you knew my late husband, Edward. I continued. He would have been so proud to see this day. In his absence, I wanted to share something special with everyone, but particularly with you, Melissa. I nodded to the waiter, who brought forward an elegant box tied with ivory ribbon. I placed it in front of Melissa. This is something borrowed, I said softly. The room fell silent as Melissa untied the ribbon and opened the box. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a delicate lace handkerchief. This belonged to Edward's mother. I explained. She carried it on her wedding day, as did I. 3 generations of Mitchell brides have held this handkerchief as they walked down the aisle. Melissa lifted the handkerchief carefully. It's beautiful, she said, and for once, she seemed genuinely touched. Thank you, Eleanor. There's something else, I said. I reached into my evening bag and withdrew an envelope, Peanut, the one containing the check she'd been expecting, but a different one entirely. This is from Edward. Thomas's head snapped up. What? Before he died, I explained, your father wrote letters to you for important moments in your life he feared he might miss. Your wedding day was one of them. With trembling hands, I passed the envelope to Thomas. He stared at it for a long moment, recognizing his father's handwriting on the front. For Thomas on his wedding day. Mom, he whispered, his eyes filling with tears. I had no idea. Your father was always thinking ahead, I said, my own voice unsteady. He wanted to be part of your special moments, even if he couldn't be here in person. The room was absolutely silent as Thomas opened the envelope and began to read. Tears streamed down his face, and beside him, Melissa looked increasingly uncomfortable with this display of raw emotion that didn't fit with her carefully planned wedding weekend. Would you like to share any of it? I asked gently when he finished reading. Thomas shook his head, folding the letter carefully and returning it to the envelope. It's private, he said, but thank you, Mom. This means everything. The dinner continued, but something had shifted. The careful facade Melissa had constructed began to crack as she watched her future husband reconnect with his past, with his father's memory, with the family history she had tried so hard to minimize. And I watched it all, sipping my wine slowly, knowing that this was just the beginning. Tomorrow, at the wedding itself, the second part of my plan would unfold. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about recognition, about making sure that as Thomas and Melissa began their new life together, they understood the importance of honoring what came before. As the evening drew to a close, I presented them with the envelope. Inside was not the check Melissa had been expecting, but a note written in my careful handwriting. Some traditions aren't meant to be broken. The confusion spread across her face as she read it. Thomas shot me a worried glance from across the table. He knew. After 30 years of raising him, he could read my expressions like a book, but he had no idea what I had set in motion, or why. Some wounds run too deep for explanations. And as we left the restaurant, I felt a curious lightness. For the first time since Edward died, I wasn't just existing in the aftermath of loss. I was still here, still Eleanor Mitchell, still a woman with agency and purpose, still someone who mattered. Tomorrow would bring the wedding day itself, and with it, the culmination of my plan. Not a revenge, but a reckoning. A reminder that even as new traditions were created, old ones deserved respect. That even as Melissa became the most important woman in Thomas's life, I would always be his mother. That some things, like the memory of a beloved wedding dress, should never